Why did German engineers test their most secret weapons, camouflaged under ridiculous agricultural designations, in the very heart of the territory of the enemy that would later annihilate them? How could a self-proclaimed elite army dare to send its soldiers to the slaughter in metal boxes whose menacing cannons were, in some cases, nothing more than painted wooden logs? A lethal deception incapable of firing a single projectile. This is the black file of a gigantic industrial hallucination where, in defiance of all laws of physics, an attempt was made to transform 15 tons of clumsy steel into a makeshift submarine, breathing through precarious hoses on the riverbeds. We reveal the anatomy of a bloody bureaucratic failure, where debating millimetres in plush offices was preferred over ensuring real firepower, turning the primary iron fist of the Wehrmacht into a rolling laboratory of design errors. Discover the bizarre story of an armoured vehicle on rails that could not roll, and the raw truth about the Panzerkampfwagen. 3. A chronicle of technological hubris, absurd compromises, and the delusional attempt to win a mechanised war with blunt weapons. It all began with a monumental bureaucratic farce on the 16th of March, 1935, when the restrictions of the Treaty of Versailles were officially declared null and void. At that precise moment, the dreaded German armoured force existed almost exclusively in the feverish imagination of strategists, for the material reality was an insult to the very definition of a modern army. To circumvent the prohibitions of the victor powers, German engineers had spent years working under the ridiculous cover of developing agricultural tractors, on machines destined for killing, conducting these secret experiments in an absurd fashion deep within the territory of the Soviet Union or in Sweden. While the global public believed Germany was constructing harmless ploughing implements, the blueprints for the Panzerkampfwagen III were coming to life on drafting tables, internally camouflaged under the codename Zugführerwagen, or section leader's vehicle. The bitter irony lay in the fact that the first newly formed panzer divisions were equipped with vehicles that, at best, served as armed target practice dummies. The Panzer I and II models, originally intended only for training and simulating real tank warfare, had to be immediately hurled into the furnace to fill the gaping void left by the total absence of true medium battle tanks. Military might was simulated with tin boxes of thin walls, while the troops' true hope, the Panzer III, was still in its infancy, tormented by the contradictory and occasionally grotesque demands of the military administration. Commanders at the front cried out for the installation of a 50mm cannon to have any chance against enemy armour, but the weapons office, in a fit of stinginess and logistical convenience, stubbornly insisted on a tiny 37mm anti-tank gun. The justification was as banal as it was bureaucratic. They simply wanted to standardise ammunition with the existing towed infantry anti-tank guns, regardless of the fact that this sabotaged the new tank's combat value from the very start. Thus was designed a 15-ton colossus whose primary armament was barely more powerful than a piece of light artillery, effectively castrating the machine's potential before it even left the factory. Simultaneously, the designers at Daimler-Benz struggled with bizarre weight restrictions of a maximum of 24 tons, dictated not by the laws of physics or tactical necessity, but by the simple load capacity of old road bridges. This led to a series of development prototypes with grotesque features in which engineers desperately tried to fit a functional chassis beneath this block of steel. The very first version, the Ausführung A, was essentially nothing more than an armoured tractor mounted on 5 oversized road wheels, with a primitive coil spring suspension, which made the vehicle pitch dangerously at the slightest bump and shook the crew inside mercilessly like a cocktail shaker. The engine output of only 250 horsepower was barely enough to propel this steel block at 30 km per hour, giving the ambitious idea of a blitzkrieg the actual appearance of a painful slow-motion film. However, the fiasco of the early prototypes did not in the least deter German engineers from repeating the same fundamental error across a series of equally inept variants, rather than immediately discarding a flawed concept. In an unprecedented waste of resources and time, an entire succession of micro-series emerged, serving internally as little more than rolling laboratories. It was clear that no one yet understood how to stably move a 15-ton steel colossus across broken ground. With the Ausführung B, they abandoned the predecessor's oversized road wheels in favour of 8 tiny wheels per side, clustered in pairs on bogies and dampened by fragile leaf springs. a move that pointlessly increased the total weight by 500 kilograms without noticeably improving cross-country mobility. The designer's obsession knew no bounds, leading to the C and D versions, where they merely tinkered with the leaf spring suspension and shock absorber placement, as if attempting to make a square wheel round simply by polishing its edges. It was only with the Ausführung E and the decisive intervention of Ferdinand Porsche that the long-awaited technical breakthrough was achieved. The archaic leaf springs were finally replaced with a sophisticated torsion bar suspension system, resting on 6 independently suspended road wheels, finally granting the vehicle the necessary stability. Parallel to this years-long chaos regarding the chassis, they indulged in the luxury of a completely over-engineered propulsion system, equipping the tank with the Maybach Vario-X gearbox, a technical monster featuring 10 forward speeds and 1 reverse, whose complexity bore no reasonable proportion to its military utility. While the tank could now theoretically reach 40 km per hour, the armament remained the primary source of anxiety. The tiny 37mm cannon on a machine that had, in the meantime, bloated to 20 tons seemed like a cruel joke. The only strategic flash of insight in this chain of erroneous decisions was a rare compromise regarding the turret ring diameter, which, at 1520mm, was designed generously enough to theoretically accommodate a heavier weapon. This, however, was not the result of wise foresight, but rather the consequence of permanent internal squabbles between the artillery inspectors and the armoured troops. Consequently, turrets were prepared for larger guns while being provisionally fitted with these ineffective door knockers. Thus, a technologically ultra-complex vehicle finally rolled off the assembly lines, one whose sophisticated engine and futuristic transmission stood in glaring contradiction to its almost laughable firepower, ready for a war that would show no mercy to engineers' playthings. When these machines finally rolled onto the battlefields, a bizarre paradox was revealed, for from a purely mathematical standpoint, these lightly armoured tin cans should have stood no chance against the steel monsters of the Allies. French colossi like the Char B1 bis or the Saumur 35 possessed significantly thicker armour and heavier guns, yet they failed grandiosely due to a banal organisational detail that German designers, almost atypically, given their usual fixation on pure technology, had placed at the very centre of their priorities. The secret of this unexpected success lay not in the hardness of the steel, but in the sheer number of occupants. While the French commander, trapped in his cramped one-man turret, had to juggle like an utterly overwhelmed circus performer, loading, aiming, commanding, and observing the environment simultaneously, 5 specialised crew members sat in the belly of the Panzerkampfwagen III. This division of labour was revolutionary and more than compensated for the gun's technical deficit. As the gunner focused solely on the target, the loader handled only the ammunition, and the commander, enthroned in his cupola, maintained an overview of the chaos without having to get his hands dirty. Added to this almost indecent luxury of personnel was another decisive factor that made opposing armies seem like deaf giants: the systematic equipping of every tank with radio sets. While Allied tank commanders often still had to frantically wave coloured flags from their hatches to send visual signals to their comrades, the crew of the Panzer III communicated via internal intercoms and coordinated with other vehicles through high-efficiency radio systems. This transformed the F and G versions, which were finally reaching the front in significant numbers, into a highly reactive wolf pack that simply outmaneuvered its technically superior prey. The Ausführung G even brought reinforced rear armour and a new commander's cupola with 5 vision blocks, further improving visibility. But even these updates could not hide the fact that they were essentially fighting with a blunt sword. The triumph across Western Europe was thus based on the grotesque reality that a group of well-connected bureaucrats in a technically mediocre vehicle proved more effective than a lone hero in an indestructible fortress. But this luck was about to turn as soon as the ships began loading for the crossing to Africa. Hardly had the desert sands of Tripoli brushed against the tracks of the 5th Light Division, disembarked in March 1941, when technicians realised with agonising clarity that German precision mechanics and fine airborne dust formed an absolutely catastrophic combination. To prevent the delicate 12-cylinder Maybach engines from breathing their lust in a mechanical agony within hours, the vehicles had to be hastily retrofitted with special tropical kits, whose monstrous air filters and enlarged cooling systems gave the tank the grotesque appearance of a rolling ventilation shaft. Yet, All these mechanical adaptations could not conceal the tactical impotence that was revealed when German units clashed, before Tobruk with British Matilda infantry tanks, whose thick armour caused German projectiles to ricochet with an almost insulting contempt. It was a matter of tragic comedy that the Wehrmacht's primary battle tank was demoted in this theatre to the role of a mere agile bait, intended to lure British units before the muzzles of the heavy 88mm anti-aircraft guns, as its own onboard armament was factually useless. The situation worsened dramatically when the Allies began deploying American Grant tanks, against which the Panzerkampfwagen III appeared like a mere toy even at the shortest distances, as long as it was not equipped with the long-barreled 50mm gun that arrived far too late. While crews desperately tried to keep their inferior vehicles alive through perpetual motion, a wooden luggage bin attached to the rear of the turret, the so-called Rommel box, became the most distinctive hallmark of this era, symbolising the fact that one had plenty of personal storage space but far too little firepower. This art of improvisation in the scorching North African heat was, however, but a lukewarm prelude compared to the strategic shock that awaited German planners when they received the fatal order to direct their tracked vehicles toward the infinite expanses of the East. When the Wehrmacht crossed the border of the Soviet Union in June 1941, the crews of the Panzerkampfwagen III suffered a brutal technical awakening that instantaneously pulverized all the theoretical staff games of the interwar period. Suddenly, German units found themselves face to face with the Soviet colossi, the T-34 and KV-1, against whose sloped armour the standard German shells shattered without effect, like peas thrown against a concrete wall, triggering a spiral of technological panic. It was a true declaration of technical bankruptcy to realise that the short 50mm cannon, with its length of 42 calibers, could only threaten the adversary at suicidal distances of less than 300 metres, while the Russian 76mm pieces picked off German armour long before they were even within range. In a fit of almost prophetic hysteria, the political leadership had demanded the installation of the more powerful 60 caliber gun much earlier, but engineers had ignored this order for months, citing bureaucratic inertia regarding a lack of turret space, which proved to be a fatal error. Under the colossal pressure of frontline reality, they desperately attempted to make up for lost time by finally installing the long gun in the Ausführung J, which however had the absurd side effect of reducing the ammunition load from 99 to 84 shells, as the projectiles were physically more voluminous. But even this measure was merely a drop in the ocean, which is why, on the subsequent L and M models, they resorted to decorating the vehicle like a Christmas tree with additional layers of steel. Spaced armour plates of 20mm were mounted on the turret front, and side skirts, the famous Schürzen, were installed to try and mitigate the effects of hollow charges and anti-tank rifles. The result was a desperately overloaded chassis that, originally designed for 15 tons, now groaned under a weight exceeding 22 tons, marking the definitive end of any possible technical evolution, for the slightest additional bolt would have transformed this once mobile hunter into a motionless and inert bunker. Since the chassis had reached its absolute technical exhaustion and could no longer support heavier armament or thicker armour without collapsing under its own weight, a phase of bizarre metamorphoses began, in which designers desperately attempted to breathe life into a dying concept. The most curious result of this identity crisis was undoubtedly the Tauchpanzer, or submersible tank, a construction that recalled the fantasies of Jules Verne more than a rational weapon of war. The vehicle was hermetically sealed with rubber gaskets that could be blown off from the inside using electric detonators in an emergency. Air for the engine and crew was supplied through a grotesque 18-metre-long hose kept on the surface by a buoy, while the tank walked blindly across riverbeds, guided only by radio commands and a gyro compass. Originally designed for the invasion of Great Britain that never materialised, this costly experiment ended in a banal crossing of the Bug River at the start of the Eastern Campaign, where this complex diving technology ultimately served only to save the effort of building a single bridge. No less adventurous was the attempt by the Sarah firm to transform the vehicle into a rail trolley by mounting the tank on train wheels to chase partisans along the tracks. However, this project failed miserably due to the excessive complexity of the power transmission to the rail axles, and the simple realisation that an ordinary armoured train handled such tasks with much greater efficiency. More successful, though it constituted a total admission of defeat, was the transformation into the Ausführung N variant, which essentially represented a large-scale recycling operation. The short 75mm guns, left over from the rearming of the Panzer IV, were simply grafted onto the turrets of the Panzer III. From then on, the former main battle tank was definitively demoted to the status of a mere water carrier, whose mission was no longer a duel against enemy armour, but rather infantry support or protecting heavy Tiger battalions from lesser targets. The height of absurdity was reached with the artillery observation tanks, where the main gun was completely removed and replaced by a wooden dummy and a machine gun, placing the crew in a machine that looked threatening but whose only protection lay in the hope that the enemy would not see through the deception of the fake pipe. The inevitable finale of this technical drama played out in July 1943 beneath the incandescent dust of the Kursk salient, where the Panzerkampfwagen III made its last grand appearance as a presumed protagonist, when in reality it had long since become a mere extra. There was a certain tragic irony in the fact that, in the largest tank battle in history, dominated by new giants like the Panther and the Tiger, nearly half of the German armoured fleet still consisted of these archaic models, serving there as little more than agile moving targets for Soviet artillery. The casualty statistics from this operation spoke a clear language. During July and August alone, 385 of these vehicles were utterly pulverised, providing definitive proof that the concept of light mobility had failed miserably in the face of a war of massive firepower. By the end of 1943, the total permanent losses had climbed to the appalling figure of 2,719 units, finally leading to the total cessation of production for the main battle tank, as the High Command admitted that no modification, however sophisticated, could save that chassis. The surviving units were then relegated in a sort of military clearance sale to secondary theatres of war such as the Balkans or Norway, where they could still exert some influence against partisans lacking heavy equipment, or they ended their careers as pure training vehicles for young recruits to learn the basics of driving, before being sent to the front in entirely different machines. One final bitter irony was revealed in the statistics of March 1945. Although Wehrmacht records still listed hundreds of these vehicles in various inventories, there was no longer a single real operational combat unit on the decisive Eastern Front, for the former pride of the Blitzkrieg strategy had long ago been recycled into scrap metal. When one sums up the balance of this years-long struggle for technical supremacy, the figure of 4,706 Panzerkampfwagen III tanks, lost without return, remains a devastating testimony, proving that even the most precise German engineering is ultimately useless when the basic concept consists of heading into a heavyweight bout with a disguised Traktor.